All right, so I'm getting a little bit back to like the actual premise for where I started this series, where I'm wearing the same shirt. So in the video prior to the last video, they would appear in that the sequence, the not the previous video, but the I don't know how you would say that backward. I think subsequent would be like the next after, but the I don't know how you would say the next before. That might be like the penultimate. So there's a no there's a penultimate is the one before last, and then there's another word for something ultimate like anti penultimate or something like that is like the one before the last one. So in the not the penultimate but the anti penultimate video to this one, I was talking about how so uh I too sometimes the coolest thing and actually real insight is when you can start to draw connections and parallels. So two of my strongest influences that I cite heavily on this channel as an example of there being that is Arthur Avalon, that is Sir John the Knight Sir John Woodroffe, the scholar from the Knight of England Sir John Woodroffe, but also the Justice of the High Court of India once upon a time Sir John Woodroffe, publishing under both the name Sir John Woodroffe, but also Arthur Avalon, which is a spiritual pseudonym and collaborative pseudonym for all of his influences, living and not living, that would have to conspire in order for him to enunciate some of his ideas. Not least of which some of his teachers of English in high tier learning venues that he was privileged to from being of a like landed class that he came from. I don't know if he was of nobility, but he was of a such a class that he was privy to find education in a unique way for that period of time where access to education would have been very hard to come by, and his writing really speaks to the type of education he had back then that I think could rival a lot of educated and erudite people to this day, what he understood in terms of science, but also writing in the English language. And so some of his spiritual heritage would also be professors in on the English side, on the Western side, but then a lot of like hermits, ascetics, and gurus in India that he had a deep appreciation for, and actually took rigors to understand their language in the first place, like Sanskrit, but then document in detail what they had to say, being very respectful. But then he also pointed out that he was aware that he would have to have blind spots and shortcomings and oversights in his understanding and even in his appreciation, just simply that he hadn't truly been reared or descended from a tradition and people. And there's something to be lost for that, but we can still find common ground. But just to be aware that there's going to be oversights and implicit biases that some of us we can't entirely get past under normal circumstances as human beings, because it's part of our perceiving is to distinguish and therefore discriminate is a part of a perception. But when it gets organized is when it's lethal and it's wrong. But in terms of taking in perception and experience, there's a degree of discriminating that's always going on for human beings, and therefore the bias would have to attend that, and also maybe a degree of arrogance and blind and short-sightedness. And he was aware of that, but so just in keeping being open about that and being respectful to the traditions that he references, but he would speak a lot about uh, for all of his understanding, he would really commend just simply manliness and a man's man that is having integrity, tact, respect, and constancy, whether that's constancy in professional engagements or personal dealings. To be a constant person is outstanding to Arthur Avalon. And then similarly, in drawing connections, I had got from the book on a tome of a book, a two-part tome of a book of a compendium of interviews of outstanding songwriters spanning the 20th century, composed compiled, composed, and also in also facilitated by Paul Zalo. I think one person in there points out that what's profound about drawing connections by things that wouldn't seem related, but that connection is the real insight. So I'm saying both Arthur Avalon respects manliness and a man's man, like a proper man in his sense, and then Nassim Nicholas Taleb respects a person who thinks original thoughts and also takes rigors to understand, rigors and passion, rigors, interest, and esteem to fathom original thought, and you maybe have to do research and run that by sources and derive from sources to think an original thought. There may not be an entirely original thought in the first place, not the least of which separate and isolated from some form of research or scholarship or priviness or entitled privilege of being influenced and receiving the inspiration and the thoughts of others would be part of an original thought. But then to offer that thought and defend that thought and stand for truth, therefore, and maybe take risks and sustain different loss and deprivation as a standpoint to further enunciate and express truth, um, is outstanding to him. But then with that, a person who would defend or stand up for what would seem weak or vulnerable is a high degree of excellence, not the least of which a form of maturity. And so I've recognized that myself, working with people of different ages and statures, is that I recognize that pattern recognition would attend development, but that pattern recognition can actually be present before what a person would be recognized as having the signs of maturity. Where sometimes I've worked with young people, and some of their reasoning, even when I'm joking and bantering, like who really is which superhero are you? Which superhero would you want to be? I would be myself, sir. I'd rather be myself. That's just an example of how the reasoning of even a young person can confound an older person sometimes. So you can have significant pattern recognition in a younger person. And I also wanted to reference that sometimes that might be what's painful when certain people experience like faith bodies or maybe learning venues, is that when a person actually has an original idea that's worth entering, that's worth saying, they might not have the authority or the standing, which a lot of times your authority and standing is a byproduct of things and people that you've referenced or that you've supplicated, or there's a degree of politics in any group dealing, including learning initiatives. So sometimes your authority and it's a byproduct of your politicking and also your sourcing of information. But original insight and idea is not necessarily contingent upon that. It's not necessarily isolated from that, but it's not necessarily contingent upon that. So sometimes when you're a young person and you really have come upon something worth saying that could benefit other people and yourself by benefiting other people, you may be shunned or silenced, because you simply don't have the standing or the authority to enter a statement like that. And there might be something gained and lost for both sides of that. But all I meant to say is that sometimes people who don't have the stature or the standing, they can actually have a keen insight sometimes. So I wanted to say that and keep with this video. But also, according to the YouTuber Tony Gaskins, is that he appreciates a distinction sometimes in the development of a female child versus a male child, verbally. And I'm saying that might actually be, and I have appreciated that might be a distinction in also maturity. Is compassion and empathy would be one of the highest marking indicators of maturity, and it's not necessarily age contingent, because I've met people who might be of a higher, have lived a lot more of life, and some of those people, they wouldn't have the same compassion and empathy as a young person. However, they would have a higher degree of pattern recognition. Where I've met people and had family members that are, they can be appreciated sometimes as maybe a little bit callous. They would seem that way, but it's sometimes just their approach of doing things. And sometimes people who are contrary or who would raise an argument are actually doing so because they're so authentic and they're not false enough to not do that. But sometimes it can come off callous, but yet their pattern recognition is redeeming and enlightening and very kind, and just simply appreciating what humans are capable of, good and bad, by having living and seeing patterns. But all I meant to say is that, but one thing that might actually account for the verbal capacity of females is that females would be constituted, it can be appreciated in terms of evolutionary psychology, to have a higher capacity for compassion and empathy, especially in supporting and raising a child of their own or a community of children, that by raising the community would also benefit their own child. So they may have instincts and talent around empathy and feeling other people. So a lot of different YouTubers have said that females are very receptive to energy. That could be a part of that motherly instinct. But if you take communication as a form of reading one another, or empathizing is part of communicating, that could also explain the verbalism, is the motherliness, and the empathy would be part of the verbalism.